In today's video, we'll dive deep into the heated debate. Were the ancient Egyptians black? We'll lay out the facts for you, drawing from both compelling archaeological finds and DNA evidence. Leave your biases at the door, whether they're Eurocentric or Afrocentric, because we're about to unravel this mystery based solely on the evidence. It's worth noting that, just like any other region on Earth, populations shift and evolve over time due to factors like conquest, famine, and disease. So, buckle up and prepare for an enlightening journey through time and history. Contrary to popular belief, the earliest inhabitants of Egypt were black people known as the Anu, who originated from southern Africa and the Great Lakes region. These early settlers first lived between what is now Sudan and southern Egypt before gradually moving northwards along the Nile. The foundations of Egyptian civilization can be traced back to the Great Lakes and southern Africa, regions considered sacred by the Egyptians. This heritage, established over 170,000 years ago in Central Africa, provided the groundwork for the development of ancient Egyptian civilization. Innovations in mathematics, writing, agriculture, architecture, and religion were developed in Africa and brought to their pinnacle by the Egyptians. The first pharaohs, likely ruling for thousands of years, governed from the south. It was a Sudanese individual named Nermari who eventually united the Nile Delta and established the first Egyptian dynasty around 3300 BC. Nermari, the first pharaoh, was unquestionably a black man. Now, let's examine the hieroglyphs. The names ancient Egyptians used for themselves and their land point to their African and black identity. The root, Kam, or Kem, means black or coal-coated, a meaning echoed in various African languages. This term is also the origin for the biblical word, Cham, used to refer to black people. Egyptians referred to themselves as Kemtiu, meaning the black or coal-coated ones. Their words for Egypt and Africa can be read as Kemet, Kama, or Kamit, all signifying black country or land of black people. Next, let us examine the painting from the tomb of Ramses III, who ruled around 1200 BC, showing that the Egyptians saw themselves as blacks, and painted themselves as such without possible confusion with the Indo-Europeans, or the Semites. It is a representation of the races in their most tiny differences, which ensures the accuracy of the colors. Throughout their entire history, the Egyptians never entertained the fantasy of portraying themselves as B or D as shown in this image, but as A and C. If this is not compelling enough, then we do not know what is. The human races known under the rule of Ramesseum, Ramses III. The Egyptians were thus as black as the other Africans, and it is the same people as they are dressed in an identical manner, and the hair is also tinged with red in the same way. Note the feline skin, which is an attribute of leaders in Africa. In the words of Sheikh Anta Diop, the great African historian, from the first dynastic period to the time of the Greek invasion, Egyptians were black. In their own words, they described themselves as coal-coated. Sheikh Anta Diop developed a melanin quantification method at his laboratory in Dakar, Senegal. Tests on ancient Egyptian mummies showed melanin levels consistent with the black race, a finding that was presented at a UNESCO symposium and went unchallenged. In 2012, DNA Tribes released analyses of two royal Egyptian mummies, Amenhotep III and Tutankhamen. The data confirmed what archaeological evidence had already suggested. Their origins lay in the Great Lakes and Southern Africa regions. Amenhotep III, father of Akhenaten, had a reign that marked the height of Egyptian power, building upon the foundations laid by Jehudi-Mezu, Thutmose III. In 2012, a study led by Zahi Hawass and published in the BMJ revealed that Pharaoh Ramesses III carried the E1B1A gene, which is predominantly found in populations from sub-Saharan Africa and among Africans in the Americas. Interestingly, the gene is especially prevalent among Angolans, a predominant Bantu people. Further research by DNA Tribes in 2013 on the DNA of Ramesses III and his son Pentueret confirmed their genetic ties to populations in the Great Lakes, Southern, Central, West, and the Horn of Africa. To make things even more interesting, Racist Eurocentric Egyptologists published a study in 2017 claiming that most Egyptians were white. This argument falls short of scientific scrutiny in so many respects. We will dismantle this erroneous pseudoscientific paper in a later video. Think about this. If a future generation 1,000 years from now digs up bones buried between 1700 and 2000 AD in the United States of America, they will claim that the original settlers in these lands were white. See how absurd that sounds? Next, we will examine published osteological research. Osteological criteria can be used to identify racial characteristics. Common features for identifying black individuals include a long forearm relative to the arm, a narrow pelvis, and specific skull dimensions. Marius Fontaine, cited by Sheikh Anta Diop, notes that the Lepsius criteria, which describes the ideal proportions of an ancient Egyptian, align with Negroid features. A 1983 study by G. Robbins titled The Physical Proportion and Living Stature of New Kingdom Pharaohs examined the skeletons of several pharaohs, including Ahmosis I, Amenhotep I, and Thutmose I, among others. Robbins concluded that the skeletal characteristics of these pharaohs, and by extension other ancient Egyptians, had Negroid features. The criteria commonly used for identifying white individuals did not align with the measurements taken from these pharaohs. Both Western and Eastern Egyptologists were unable to connect the ancient Egyptian language to Indo-European or Semitic language families. It was Sheikh Anta Diop in the 1950s who demonstrated that the ancient Egyptian language had significant similarities with Wolof, his own language. This led to the recognition of ancient Egyptian as a Black African language, belonging to the same language family as other African languages. How about the religious practices of the ancient Egyptians? Egyptian culture, including totemism, matriarchal family structures, funeral rituals, and royal systems, shares fundamental similarities with sub-Saharan Africa. Despite common portrayals, ancient Egyptian religion was not polytheistic but closely aligned with religious practices in Black African communities. The notion of polytheism in ancient Egypt is disseminated to diminish Africa's contribution to the concept of monotheism. Notable ancient Greek scholars who visited Africa described the Egyptians as black. Sheikh Anta Diop collected these accounts in his work, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality? Greek writers who had no conception of what would happen to the world millennia later spoke the truth about the Egyptians they saw in their day. This is irrefutable evidence that slams the door shut on the current Eurocentric views of ancient Egyptians. Let's next listen to the words of ancient Greek scholars, whose accounts have shaped Western ideology. Herodotus, often called the father of history, noted, "The Colchians are of Egyptian race, they have black skin and frizzy hair." Aristotle stated, "Those who are too black are cowards, like the Egyptians and Ethiopians." Aeschylus, a Greek poet, described Egyptian sailors as having black skin and wearing white tunics. Lucian, a Greek writer, described an Egyptian as not only black but also slender-legged, with his hair in a braid. Diodorus Siculus cited accounts from other Africans, stating that Egyptians are a colony led by Osiris from Ethiopia. Even during the Roman occupation, Ammianus Marcellinus remarked that the men of Egypt are mostly brown and black. It should be noted that he made this remark, despite the extended presence of whites in Egypt for 600 years by that point in history. So were the Egyptians black throughout their entire civilization? Egyptian civilization dates back 27,000 years, well before the emergence of non-black populations. The first significant white invasion occurred with the Assyrians in 663 BCE, marking the start of Egypt's decline. Subsequent invasions by the Persians in 525 BCE and the Greeks in 332 BCE ended native black rule. The Romans followed in 31 BCE. The Arabs invaded in 639 CE, almost a millennium after the last native Egyptian dynasty and 600 years after the close of pharaonic civilization in Egypt. By the time the Arabs arrived in Egypt in 639 CE, many indigenous black Egyptians had already migrated to other parts of Africa. These migrations contributed to groups like the Soninke in Mali and Mauritania, the Arkan in Ghana and Ivory Coast, the Yoruba in Nigeria, the Bassa in Cameroon, and possibly the Zulu and Xhosa in South Africa. Those who remained in Egypt had already intermingled with previous non-black invaders. These are today's Copts. Despite their light skin, the Copts speak a language rooted in black African heritage. Therefore, the Arabs who now occupy Egypt have no direct or indirect connection to ancient Egyptian civilization, a fact they are aware of but do not emphasize to maintain tourism revenue to modern-day Egypt. Jean Vercoutrer, a notable French Egyptologist, stated that ancient Egypt was African in its culture, writing, and thought processes. During the 1974 Cairo Conference on Ancient Egyptian Identity, there was a notable disparity in the thoroughness of presentations. Despite this, UNESCO affirmed that Sheikh Anta Diop and Théophile Obenga, African Egyptologists, were correct in asserting that Egypt was a fundamentally black African civilization. Next, let's examine the question of why similar engineering marvels such as the Great Pyramids were not found in other parts of Africa. Some Eurocentric archaeologists of the 18th and 19th century claimed blacks as being intellectually inferior and, hence, could not have built Egypt. The question of intelligence based on ethnicity is both scientifically unfounded and culturally biased. It is incorrect to say that black people are not as intelligent as white people. Such a notion perpetuates harmful stereotypes and has been debunked by extensive research in the fields of anthropology, psychology, and sociology. While it's true that Egypt experienced periods of decline during foreign occupations, this does not reflect on the intelligence of a racial or ethnic group. Furthermore, numerous other civilizations have thrived across Africa following Egypt's historical period. Indeed, Africans built stone monuments long before European colonization. Examples include the civilization of Wagadu in ancient Ghana and the civilization of Great Zimbabwe. Before the shadow of European slave raids and colonization darkened its soil, Africa was a vibrant land of majestic empires, arguably the wealthiest continent on Earth. Yet it was the cruel chapters of slavery and colonial rule that ingrained a false narrative of inferiority in the minds of Africans. This psychological scar has made it difficult for many to reconcile the notion that they are the descendants of the creators of history's grandest civilization, a civilization that not only shaped antiquity but also laid the very foundations of human advancement.